So my name is Mark Edwards, and I'm introducing this 19th International Conference in Patristic Studies in my capacity as the incoming chair of the Faculty Board of Theology at the University of Oxford. But that itself is not uncommon. We've had introductions from faculty board chairs for several conferences, but this, I think, is the first one at which a person is also able to introduce the conference in the capacity of director. I've been a director of the conference since 1995, which is a substantial portion of its history, but by no means the whole. Those of you who are familiar with Oxford and its theology faculty will know that patristics has always been a very important subject to us and still continues to be. Many of you in previous conferences will have encountered such figures as Henry Chadwick, Maurice Wiles, Callistus Ware, Robert Thompson, the Armenian scholar, Rowan Williams, and J.N.D. Kelly, figures who have an international reputation as scholars of the early church. The subject is no longer compulsory, as it was on the Oxford syllabus when I began to teach, but it is still taken by something like a third of our undergraduates studying theology and religion. We still have at least 4 post holders, paid employees of the university who have expertise to teach the subject, together with a number of people who are not post holders. So by comparison with most universities, it remains a very important part of our understanding of what it is to study not merely Christian theology, but to study the very nature and history of religion. Initially, patristics was pretty well the whole of theology at Oxford, apart from Old Testament studies and New Testament studies. They saw no reason why the syllabus should go beyond the year 451, at which point all the necessary questions in Christian theology had been decided once and for all. The Regius Professor of Divinity explained the inevitable process by which heresies had arisen and been eliminated until the Chalcedonian definition solved all questions for all time. And the Regius Professor of Ecclesiastical History explained that the primacy of Rome was a concept that was completely unknown to any church father before 451. The Regius Professor of Divinity protected us from the nonconformists, and the Regius Professor of Ecclesiastical History protected us from the papists. And that goes up to the time, I think, of Professor Greenslade in the mid-20th century. And in the light of that, one could say that Leslie Cross's initiative in 1951 to found what is now the International Conference in Patristic Studies was really quite liberal, unusually ecumenical. It was Leslie Cross's intention to bring together colleagues from around Europe and America to study the Church Fathers with a view to bringing about understanding between the great Christian confessions. Leslie Cross's original conference was what we might now call a colloquium at best, or barely more than a seminar really, probably not more than a dozen people. And over the years, the conference grew in number, but it didn't grow in the way that it does now by people applying. You could only come to the conference for many years by invitation. The conference was organized from the very beginning in 1951, right up to 1995. For 44 years, it was organized by the same person. The same person sent out the invitations. The same person asked people who were already invited to suggest other people who might be invited, and so on. That person, as many of you will know, was Betsy Livingston, also well known as the editor of the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, nominally at least with Leslie Cross, but again, those of you who know Betsy will know that virtually all the work on the first 3 editions of the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church was done by her. Just as pretty well all the logistic work towards the preparation of this conference was done by Betsy for those 44 years from 1951 to 1995. At that point, Betsy retired and declined invitations to attend the conference after that, but she remained a very well-known figure in Oxford, and it was only last year that she actually died at a very advanced age, and a requiem mass will be held for her tomorrow morning early at Pusey House for any of you who remember her and wish to pay your respects. Since that time, the conference has been open to anyone who wished to submit an abstract or to register, and of course, like every other conference, we have taken electronic registrations, and numbers have grown and grown. And indeed, the character of patristics has changed. Patristics, properly speaking, I think, is just a study of early Christian doctrine, but we have gone well beyond doctrine, liturgy, and the other things that interested Leslie Cross. Many of our papers could be described as sociological, historical, biographical, literary, critical, philosophical, and the idea of what period patristics covers has also expanded to the point where many of our papers are post-Chalcedonian, and even some of them could be described as late Byzantine, or at least mid-Byzantine, and we also have sessions on reception. It has become an enormous undertaking, and for many years it was managed by the excellent Priscilla Frost and her Oxford Conference management team. Priscilla also retired after the last conference, and because of the lockdown and the many inconveniences that it imposed upon the conference trade, in fact, Oxford Conference management no longer exists. The organisation of the present conference has been really quite a heroic effort on the part of a limited number of people. We have never had a full conference team. We have had invaluable help from administrators of the Faculty of Classics, particularly Hayley Merchant and more recently Eleanor Galloway. We have had assistance also from two members of the university, Sarah Apatry and Ian Palmer, but an absolutely incredible logistic burden has been borne by my co-chair of directors, Professor Cara Harrison, the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity, who has worked week by week for many months, ensuring that accommodation was available when we discovered to our horror that the college rooms that were normally available would no longer be available in Oxford, just making sure that emails were answered, that registrations were actually noted, that money was refunded where it had to be refunded, that catering was provided, that venues were booked. An enormous amount of work which would normally be done by a management team was done by Professor Harrison herself, and I think we owe her a great ovation for that. We've also had, as always, an excellent team of directors, too many to name now, but Marcus Vincent has continued to manage the website as he has for 4 or 5 preceding conferences, including receiving all your abstracts for the papers, which we've been arranging on the timetable. And Philip Booth is the person who has arranged the chairs for those communication sessions. Again, the timetable is a laborious exercise. My recollection of the 1990s is that Betsy Livingston invited me, Maurice Wiles, and Robert Thompson to a room which was full of coloured paper chits on which handwritten titles of people's intended communications were written. And we simply had to sort through all these chits and make bundles of 8 or 9 of them, and that constituted a communication session. I have to say that was the quickest and most efficient way of arranging the communications that I've ever discovered. Much more efficient than having to deal with the absolute chaos of disinformation and half-truth that one gets nowadays through the electronic website provided to us by Oxford Abstracts. If there have been, as there certainly have been, duplications and omissions and misunderstandings, then I can only plead that the information that reaches us, which is not necessarily the information you tried to give us, doesn't always make an awful lot of sense. But I very much hope that your papers are all scheduled where they ought to be scheduled and everything's together that ought to be together. And we certainly hope that you'll all have a wonderful time with all these incredibly interesting workshops and communication sessions that are on offer, 16 running at a time for most of the day for the next 4 days. So I hope that everyone will find something to amuse them for every minute of those forthcoming days. Thank you.
It is a genuine pleasure to introduce and celebrate Professor Paul Blowers this evening. Paul is the Dean E. Walker Professor of Church History at Emmanuel Seminary at Milligan College in Tennessee. Paul has been a central figure in North American study of early Christianity for a number of decades, and he served as the president of the North American Patristic Society in 2008-9. Paul's research may perhaps be described as dividing into two different bodies of work. In the first place, we have a series of important contributions to the study of Maximus the Confessor, beginning with his 1991 volume, Exegesis and Spiritual Pedagogy in Maximus. His subsequent publications in this area have established him as one of the most important scholars working today on this 7th century father. And then, in the second place, there are a series of essays and volumes that stem in different ways from Paul's love of drama. Drama is for Paul no purely academic interest. Paul is himself an accomplished thespian. Out of this interest, Paul has produced 2 volumes particularly worthy of note, I think. The first is his Drama of the Divine Economy, studying the development of the theology of creation through the early Christian centuries. And the second is his recent monograph, Visions and Faces of the Tragic, a fascinating reflection on the dramatic character of faith in fall and salvation through the early centuries. Now, I've spoken of 2 themes, but the 2 are united by Paul's interest in early Christian biblical exegesis. Throughout his work runs a consistent interest in exploring ways in which the Christian imagination is shaped by the language and dramatic structures of the scriptural texts. It's easy enough to see how those various themes are interwoven in the title of Paul's lecture tonight, playing along with the playful logos, theatrics and dramatics in patristic writing and biblical interpretation. Paul, thank you for accepting our invitation to open the 19th Oxford Patristics Conference, and now it's time for us to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Lewis. Those are the nicest things you've ever said about me. I want to personally thank Carol Harrison and Mark Edwards and Phil Booth and the entire committee that puts this extraordinary conference on its feet and gets us all organized into our proper themes, our proper times, our proper places. It is a labor of love, and we thank you for that. I affectionately call this conference, and have for years, the quadrennial Disneyland for scholars of early Christianity. At some point in the mid-5th century, as Christian basilicas continued to be configured as performance spaces, Basil, bishop of Seleucia in Byzantine Isauria, took to the ambo or some other station of his cathedral church to deliver a homily for the Feast of the Holy Innocents. Presumably, a lector, if not the bishop himself, had already read their story, which, though compacted into a few verses, leaps off the pages of the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Sparing his audience no distance whatsoever from the event, Basil plunged headlong into the horror of the infant's mass murder at Herod's bidding, and I quote him, "For me, the infant's cries still echo all around, and I have imagined watching them. These babes wailing indiscriminately with terror as they saw the gleaming of the swords and turned in panic to their mother's arms for safety, then sank into their bosoms. I consider, too, the mothers themselves looking on, one here and another there, passing through the city with their piteous and precious cargo, seeking a place of refuge, and not even receiving a decent veil over their eyes when the danger reached its peak. I think of one mother trying to escape and casting herself into totally unfamiliar courses of action. Still another mother I see vainly flinging her hair over her child, hoping by such modest shelter to steal him away from the danger. Yet another mother I imagine being violently cornered by her pursuers, then withdrawing and being stricken with fear and crying her eyes out and gazing at the flashing sword, dividing her attention between the sword's forward motion and her baby boy about to be hacked, and instinctively insinuating herself between the weapon and the child she holds. In addition, I see another mother able neither to move nor to exhale even a little, frozen in her tracks by terror, having already consumed herself with a parent's proper fear, and awaiting with faint wailing the smiting sword," unquote. At one level, certainly, these sobering words model the rhetorical ekphrasis exhibited so widely in patristic preaching, intended to amplify and redescribe events with a vividness that powerfully grips both speaker and audience, capturing them fully in the story. Basil's sermon on the Holy Innocents, though informed in some of its details by Gregory of Nyssa's earlier homily on Christmas Day, goes much further, portraying the demented Herod as mounting not a mere police action, but a full-scale military campaign against the defenseless babies. Basil's homily was so revered for its riveting effects that it became the standard for subsequent Byzantine homilists and poets, including the renowned Romanus the Melodist, who in his characteristic way added features and dialogues to this narrative to augment its dramatic impact. Details from Basil's homily even influenced the imaging of the massacre in subsequent Christian art. And yet the sophistication of ekphrasis and other rhetorical instruments abundantly deployed by early Christian preachers and writers, the subject of a burgeoning scholarship, is not my primary concern here. Nor is the well-attested fact that numerous late ancient Christian authors embellished their works with theatrical imagery. Basil's evocative homily on the Holy Innocents tips an enormous iceberg of the transformation of Christian discourse about the dramatic and especially the tragic character of sacred revelation. How far could or would Christian authors allow their audiences to be scandalized by the unmitigated theatrics and dramatics of the biblical narratives that they heard in church? Basil, after all, was not just displaying rhetorical savoir-faire. He was posing himself as a liturgical dramaturge, willing to throw open a scriptural story shot through with tragic outrages. Outrages all the more scandalous since the cult of the Holy Innocents had probably originated, at least in part, to counteract criticism of the infant Jesus surviving the slaughter at other babies' expense. The story itself, moreover, was like a perfect interpretive storm, inducing visceral emotions not easily quelled with rhetorical consolations, while also posing discomforting questions of divine justice, not routinely obviated by traditional theodicies or by refocusing attention on the villainy of Herod himself. John Chrysostom acknowledged both of these when he cautioned the audience of his homily on the event to moderate its indignation and mania over the mass slaughter. But as Maria Dörfler has emphasized in her recent study of the death of children in Christian antiquity, various patristic exponents threw additional rhetorical fuel on the fire by detailing the gruesome spectacle of the infanticide, eulogizing the baby's moral purity, and playing up the sad irony of their total passivity to martyrdom. Dörfler asserts that there was a likely disparity between learned interpreters who found ways to fit children's premature deaths in the Bible into their constructions of salvation history, and ordinary Christians' experience of children's deaths more as a quotidian reality than an occasion for catharsis. This takes us straight away to the threshold of the efficacy of theatrical preaching and commentary. Even when couched within the larger drama of liturgy, did such preaching potentially fall flat, becoming a vain exercise in overly sophisticated artistic mimesis? Could it become, in the worst-case scenario, mere show, impressive in the moment but failing to convict its audiences long-term? Did it draw audiences into biblical dramas and into the dramas playing out in the church's foreground in ways that counterproductively estranged them? When, for example, the two Cappadocian Gregories in their orations on poverty graphically redescribe the indigent and diseased in the public domain as characters playing out a doleful tragedy, the goal may have been to invoke Christian mercy. But the risk, as Aristotle knew when he proposed pity and fear as the paradigmatic tragic emotions, was to scare off an audience by rendering the character's sufferings too close for comfort, enabling fear or revulsion to preempt pity altogether. Finally, there were the intrinsic hazards of theatrical mimesis itself. In his critique of the poets and tragedians, dubbing them traffickers in raw emotion, Plato had claimed that their mimesis was at third remove from reality, seeking to imitate what the masses already saw as the mere appearance of things. Patristic biblical expositors were themselves susceptible to the criticism that their mimesis of the biblical author's own mythopoeic mimesis of divine realities was similarly remote. As Ruth Webb has further noted, Christian writers and preachers had constantly to navigate the boundary between social mimesis, learning by imitation a new Christian way of life, and the imperfect mimesis of the theater, with its endlessly plastic performers and performances. The fact remains, however, that all manner of Christian authors continued unabated to take the risks of theatricality, confident that dramatic art still had unique power not only to reshape their audience's moral reasoning, but also to sharpen their spiritual senses. And so in the remainder of my talk, I will be exploring in more detail the basis of their confidence. The most promising way forward, in my judgment, is to track the different dimensions of early Christian appropriation of tragedy and the tragic, since the heritage of Greco-Roman tragic drama, enduringly pliable, proved one of the most fertile ancient poetic resources positively and negatively for Christian authors. The modern literary critic George Steiner accurately claimed that classical tragedy was a quote-unquote enacted testing of theodicy, which would partially hold true for Christian authors. But Steiner was quite mistaken, I suggest, when he further deduced that the rise of Christianity, with its hopeful eschatology and resistance to existential dead ends, spelled the death of classical tragedy. Steiner's conclusion is compelling on the face of it, of course. Early Christian polemicists lumped together tragic stage plays with the whole array of pagan spectacles. Minucius Felix mocked the irony that, quote, "For feigned sorrows the actor moves you to tears by unreal nods and gestures, till in the arena you clamor for the bloodshed for which upon the stage you weep," unquote. Tertullian famously smeared tragedy and comedy alike as prurient visual seduction, while still recognizing that the eyes have to be converted toward the salutary spectacles offered by the Christian revelation. And of course, the censure of spectacle still echoed in Greek, Latin, and Syriac patristic sources well into the 4th century and beyond. And yet, more than other forms of Greco-Roman poetics, tragedy had undergone a long tradition of philosophical vetting. Ever since Plato portrayed an Athenian lawgiver announcing to the tragedians that, quote, "We ourselves, to the best of our ability, are the authors of a tragedy at once superlatively fair and good. At least our entire model of the state is framed as a representation of the fairest and best life, which is in reality, as we assert, the truest tragedy," unquote. More than conceding the rhetorical and cultural power of the poets, Plato was acknowledging, albeit begrudgingly, that tragedy had a peculiar philosophical force of its own, even if it targeted more the passible than the rational human subject. Aristotle was far less begrudging, upholding the value of tragic mimesis to the point of downplaying mere spectacle and stipulating the conditions of effective plots that imitated what he called probability and necessity in life, with the possibility of cleansing or perhaps retraining the visceral passions of fear and pity. In grappling with God's evil, freedom, suffering, fatality, and much more, tragedy held the prospect of generating new horizons of emotional intelligence and moral insight. Christian authors thereupon had the advantage of capitalizing on these antecedent traditions of philosophical critique of tragic drama. And this in an era when staged tragedies were gradually becoming rarer, ultimately giving way to mimed or danced versions or even rhetorical readings. Early on, Plato's critique echoed in Tertullian's insistence that, quote, "If the literature of the stage delight you, we have literature in abundance of our own, plenty of verses, sentences, songs, proverbs, and these not in fables, but true. Not tricks of art, but plain realities," unquote. But bypassing the art of imitating tragedy was not to be in the Christian tradition, especially in patristic biblical interpretation. Clement of Alexandria set in motion a dialectical approach, decrying the tragedians' deceit while extensively citing them in his Patristics to show that they occasionally did land on truths. Later on, Lactantius thrashes the idolatry of pagan tragedies and comedies, and yet admits that, quote-unquote, no poetic work is a total fiction, since it can veil truths, and even quotes a line attributed to Euripides to the effect that earth's ills are heaven's goods. Following Varro's designation of the tragedians as theologians of myth or story, Eusebius of Caesarea, despite his aversions to their work, concedes their historic status as lower-level theologians, while also deferring to Clement's judgment about their occasional insights, and honoring the positive breakthrough achieved by the Hellenistic Jewish playwright Ezekiel the Tragedian in his remarkable drama onto Moses and the Exodus. Meanwhile, but especially from the 4th century on, the language of tragedy and the tragic underwent significant rehabilitation in Christian formal discourse and colloquial usage alike. Athanasius, Gregory Nazianzen, John Chrysostom, and others provided precedent for other authors to describe disasters in their own careers as tragedies in the making. Even terms for ill fortune, bad luck, fate, and the like were increasingly domesticated without fear of undermining confidence in divine providence. As when Theodoret of Cyrus, soliciting benefaction for the Carthaginian Christian senator Celestiacus and his refugee family displaced by the Vandal invasion, appeals to one bishop in fully styled tragic language, I quote, "To recount the sufferings of the most honorable and illustrious Celestiacus would require tragic eloquence. For those poets fully elicit the tragedies of humanity, but I can only briefly inform your excellency that his homeland is Libya, long celebrated far and wide. His city, the far-famed Carthage, his hereditary rank, a seat in her illustrious Senate, his circumstances affluent. But all that is now a tale, mere words stripped naked of reality. For the barbarian war has now deprived him of all of this. But such is human good fortune, which refuses to remain always with the same persons and hastens to move on to dwell with others." Unquote. The mimesis of tragedy and exploration of classic elements of tragedy that Aristotle outlined in his Poetics took on more explicitly dramatic form, however, in patristic biblical exposition, as the moral complexity of various narratives and characters in sacred history demanded a greater exegetical transparency, such as both problematized and fertilized theological interpretation. Aristotle's stipulations for effective tragic plots were ripe for exegetical picking. Larger-than-life characters with whom we can still identify since they are morally ordinary, a failing, hamartia, likely a disastrous miscalculation more than a latent tragic flaw as such, on the part of the protagonist. The protagonist's horrific discovery of this egregious misstep, leading to a radical reversal of fortune, and so too a grievous suffering with little or no hope of being assuaged. We need look no further than Eden, a theater all its own, the primordial learning experience of concrete existence, where patristic interpreters largely resisted speculating about some antecedent ontological flaw in Adam and Eve, apart from their creaturely mutability or immaturity, but dramatically played up their miscalculation, their shocking discovery of their nakedness as a dangerous new vulnerability, and the reversal of their paradisiac fortune as the commencement of a stunted existence where the unreality of evil has taken on its own veil of reality. The Cappadocians, Chrysostom, other Greek ascetical theologians treating Adam and Eve as proto-ascetics strain to explain the peculiar character of their ignorance and their ostensive capacity to invent moral evil. Their discovery was compounded by the realization when their eyes were opened, as the text says, that their new mixed knowledge was no knowledge at all. In the West, Ambrose, Augustine, and the episcopal poet Avitus of Vienne moved toward depicting the fall as more like a comedy of errors or epistemic misfires. Avitus even restages the story as a tragedy in his epic poem on original sin, deploying prosopopoeia to give Satan a decisive voice and to craft rhetorically loaded declamations on the lips of Adam and Eve so as to enhance their anguish, all the while insinuating his own commentarial voice in place of the tragic chorus. Especially striking, however, is Avitus's playing up the story's moral ambiguity and resistance to simplistic resolution. When, for example, Satan feigns orthodoxy in his seduction of Eve, citing the superior dignity of humans among creatures as legitimate grounds for them to pursue a heavenly comprehension of reality, delusion is allowed to sound like insight. Though villainous, Satan expertly exposes the thin line between illicit human curiosity and the aspiration to a higher understanding of the world. Already in the primeval history, tragedy emerges as a frighteningly new normal. All the more so as patristic interpreters turn to its multiform iterations in sacred history. More than a fiasco of disastrous miscues, the fall had erupted the prospect of a dystopia of metaphysical proportions. The specter of spiritual and physical death having arrived, was it possible now to speak of humans as ontologically and not just existentially tragic beings? With the saga of Cain and Abel, patristic mimesis of tragedy took a new turn, becoming more proactive in managing appearances. Since from one angle, one very disturbing angle, Cain seemed to have been set up for his failed sacrifice and fateful destiny. Except for the Septuagint, the textual recensions of Genesis 4 were awkwardly silent on why God favored Abel's animal sacrifice over Cain's agricultural one, and why God warned Cain about his sacrifice only after he had already performed it, and why God would do anything so blatantly unjust. Certain patristic expositors followed Philo in emphasizing in the text that only after some days did Cain make his sacrifice, implying that he had held back from God his first fruits. But justice aside, Cain's vice was not just murder, but the deadliness of envy, a notorious vice in Greek tragedy, unleashed against his brother and insidiously infecting the whole human race. Such inspired one anonymous Syriac poet to compose a pathos-laden dialogue where the Christ figure Abel counsels and consoles Cain on the cosmic repercussions of his fratricide. In a peculiarly grim, tragic fatality, the accursed and exiled Cain, though protected from harm, had to groan and tremble on the earth, even as that same earth served notice against him. In the Georgian recension of the life of Adam and Eve, Cain tries to bury Abel, only to find that his limbs keep sticking up out of the rebellious ground. Cain, in his new world, away from the presence of God, graphically signals to audiences how, as Athanasius claimed, deviant humanity threatens to revert to non-existence and oblivion. And yet Chrysostom, characteristically more rhetorically resistant to dead ends, insists that Cain's downfall made the prospect of his repentance and redemption, however dim, all the more compelling. This is one among other cases of tragic mimesis in which Christian authors let the horror speak for itself without forcing a resolution. The saga in Judges 11 of the Israelite mercenary Jephthah, whose fateful vow to God on the eve of battle precipitated the sacrificial death of his innocent daughter, pressed Christian commentators with whether a biblical tragedy could be, at the end of the day, utterly senseless and irredeemable. The proposed explanations ran from Chrysostom's condemnation of making idle vows to God to Ephraim the Syrian's defense of Jephthah's exemplary combination of lamentation and stoicism, to Ambrose's view that Jephthah acted under a classically tragic miserabilis necessitas. To Jacob of Serug's homiletic assertion that Jephthah knowingly sacrificed his daughter to prefigure God's sacrifice of his own son. To various claims about the daughter's admirable show of virginal virtue in preparation for martyrdom. Elsewhere, the pathological envy of King Saul, which as Basil of Caesarea observed, was accentuated precisely by targeting his very own benefactor, David, and capped by the king's desperate consultation of a medium to discern his fate, manifested a tragic dead end of its own. Unsurprisingly, the story of Job's devastation strongly tested the viability of patristic mimesis of biblical tragedy. Theodore of Mopsuestia contested the credibility of Job as Christian scripture precisely because of its blatant resemblance to Greek tragedy, and incurred conciliar condemnation for his view. Although Chrysostom, in unapologetically defining Job as a tragedy, explored its characters' dialogues in substantial depth. Like most interpreters, Chrysostom shied away from considering the book a direct assault on the justice of God, the God who handed righteous Job over to Satan's designs, even though he also lambasted the three comforters' jaded rationalizations of Job's reversal of fortune. More purely tragic still, as Maria Dörfler has highlighted, is the dour reflection on Job's loss in one anonymous sermon on Job that is attributed to Chrysostom. Pseudo-Chrysostom's Job mulls over the corpses of his dead children and struggles in vain to reorganize their scattered body parts, while confessing to his audience, quote, "I am confused in my soul. I think you experience the same as well. How to describe such a great tragedy, I do not know, even if I had the most perfect encomium for Job on my tongue," unquote. Other instances of tragic mimesis in biblical interpretation had more the look of Shakespeare's hybrid of tragicomedy. Certain commentators on the sibling rivalry of Jacob and Esau admitted that the story bordered on farce, with the firstborn Esau squandering his inheritance for a bowl of beans, and the huckster Jacob, a mama's boy, assuming greatness despite his deceits. Chrysostom parallels the story with the Greek tragedy in which Oedipus's twin sons, Eteocles and Polynices, rivaled to the point of killing each other. Technically, because Jacob and Esau ultimately wrought a happy ending by reconciling, the story qualified under Aristotle's definition as a comedy. Yet the tragic element could not be set aside, at least not for Esau. Not when God had pronounced by the testimony of Malachi and the Apostle Paul those famous words, "Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." Augustine reframes Jacob and Esau figuratively within the larger economy of divine predilection and election, but still allows a tragic dark side that cannot be explained away, even if we're focusing on the graciousness of God. In the New Testament, too, various preachers discerned the tragicomical pattern in the story, believe it or not, of John the Baptist, addressing textual details that seem to imply that John, a man already destined to decrease, was in over his head, a dupe caught up in relation to Jesus while not fully aware of Jesus' identity, as when he asked from prison whether Jesus was truly the one who is to come. But Hezekias of Jerusalem and Peter Chrysologus, in respective homilies, moved quickly to vindicate John as an honorably tragic hero, whose ostensive wavering merely set in bolder relief his willing exposure for Jesus' sake to the mockery of the Herodian court. The vixen's dance for the head of the Baptist, says Chrysologus, was simultaneously a ludicrous comedy and a heinous tragedy. The collective risk of tragic mimetics in biblical exposition was to dispense too much disturbing interpretive information on audiences while also unleashing an emotional overload. Amplifying the dramatic force of a tragic narrative in sacred revelation could deepen an audience's perspective, cut through its naivete, but also leave individual believers aghast, skeptical, disconsolate, and confused, and not just liable to the classic tragic passions of fear and pity. It's instructive, in turn, to explore how patristic preachers and commentators subtly reworked Aristotle's principle of catharsis with its multiple functions in helping an audience to process tragedy. I'll turn to that briefly later. But patristic authors pressed for something more comprehensive, a broader Christian tragic subjectivity, attuned to tragedy not only in the Bible, but in the church's own experience. It helped to have some exemplary tragic subjects, or selves, persons who masterfully interpreted human existence, including their own, through a tragic lens. And I must limit myself, unfortunately, here to Gregory Nazianzen, whose autobiographical poetry and other select works scripted his own life as one of tragic heroics in a dense plot with a whole cast of characters. Gregory's recognition of his ongoing tragic condition follows quite well Aristotle's advisement that in tragedy, fellow characters can appear as friends or enemies, depending on virtuous or vicious guises. Some of Gregory's villains are predictable, such as the Emperor Julian, cast as a tragic comic par excellence, or Gregory's episcopal rival, the turncoat Bishop Maximus the Cynic. Other villains are less likely, including Gregory of Nyssa, at least when Nazianzen quotes Euripides to castigate his friend for tragically pursuing a secular career as a rhetorician. Gregory portrays his own tragic reversal of fortune as his downfall into the abyss of ordained ministry and ecclesiastical affair. All along the way, in good tragic fashion, Nazianzen flirts rhetorically with fate. His verses teem with allusions to the fleeting character of fortune, life's relentlessly disastrous ends, the atrophy of good over time, and evil's complex machinations. His reflections compare, interestingly, with the autobiographical oration of his pagan contemporary Libanius of Antioch, who speaks of the quote-unquote, quote, providence of fate, the pranoia tikis, amid the miseries of his own life, a fate that hosts rather than impedes his moral quest. Gregory is willing to bring his audience to the brink, to navigate the precipice between order and chaos, even in Christian existence, because he purports tragic verse with its high emotion is a pleasing medicine, a paregoric for souls. What is more, Gregory sometimes speaks as his own tragic chorus, observing himself from a distance as an objectified tragic self locked in multiple subplots involving family, close friendships, intellectual elites, ascetical circles, priesthood, episcopate, laity, theological partisans, and of course the empire. But Gregory projects the tragic Christian self as larger than his own personal experience. He draws his audiences into the vortex of his emotions, of which he is still in full rhetorical command, as a means to train them for their own experience of the precarious interplay of providence and fate. This sharpening of Christians' tragic subjectivity for Nazianzen and other late ancient Christian moralists furthermore entailed not just individual self-reflection on the tragic character of human life, but also the nurturing of a tragic conscience, the capacity to perceive and mercifully respond to all manner of tragedies playing out in the church's foreground, the stage shared with Roman society. Doing so meant identifying exemplary groups under the grip of hopelessness. The Cappadocians' sermons on the poor and diseased expressly redescribe indigent and deformed persons as actors in a tragic theater of the grotesque. Though Basil and the two Gregories know full well the danger of being too graphic, making the spectacle so abject that the audience is nauseated rather than led to empathy, they all plow ahead rhetorically and theologically, upholding the unique and transformative indwelling of such persons by Christ as an antidote to Christian complacency toward them. Another identifiable group was social parasites, whose fate appeared to be sealed by tragic circumstance, living as they did on the edge between poverty and ill-gotten gain through sycophancy, sponging, and sordid buffoonery at pagan and Christian dinner parties, doubtless knowing that parasites were already loathsome in the public eye and were favorite stock characters in Greek comedy. Chrysostom nonetheless brings them on stage in various homilies as tragic jesters who parody the toxic relation between wealthy patrons and those whom they exploit. He too, like the Cappadocians, lets his theology get the better part of his rhetorical judgment. Though vilifying parasites' own exploitation of the social system, he imagines a scenario where they could be redeemed and even employed by Christian benefactors. The Gallican preacher, Valerian of Simier, similarly employs a tragic pathos to describe parasites' desperation and dehumanizing humiliation, even in the company, and especially in the company of Christians. Might even the likes of these pathetic souls prompt the Christian conscience to new levels of mercy? Another whole horizon of patristic tragic mimesis dramatized married persons and ascetics. Gregory Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, and Ambrose, while defending marriage, all wax eloquent on the tragedies of married life, where the young couple starts out so well in the blissful honeymoon period, but is then met with the stark, fateful realities of childlessness, mother's death in childbirth, husband's bitter grief, the possibility of premature orphanhood and widowhood, the prospect of unruly children, and so on. Marriage and child rearing, despite their virtues, appeared to embody the vanity and finitude of human existence in ways that the virginal life did not. At the same time, it was hardly lost on patristic authors and hagiographers that the lives of ancient ascetics and monastics, especially in various forms of self-marginalization and self-mortification, were the embodied enactment of a tragic mimesis, throwing oneself into a pious fatalism. Indeed, the parody and satire of an ascetic existence could exhibit itself as tragicomedy par excellence, being, as I said, susceptible to pagan ridicule and Christian criticism alike. There are many examples of this, of course, but I choose Leontius of Neapolis' engrossing life of the 6th century ascetic Simeon the Holy Fool, who made an outrageous public nuisance of himself, performing lewd acts fully intended to scandalize in public the morally distracted Christian community, but also to heap scorn upon himself in identification with Jesus' own public humiliation. Leontius was fully aware of the fine line being played, and that the dramatic power of Simeon's parody was at risk if the audience of his hagiography was not in on this deadly serious joke. Indeed, we can imagine a whole range of audience responses to the story, from revulsion to disbelief to raucous laughter to awkward snickering. But for those in on Simeon's ruse, a metamorphic mercy toward his extravagant personal kenosis in the imitation of Christ. There were, of course, still other groups held up as objects of Christian tragic conscience, including non-Christian Jews, whose plight under the Seleucids and Romans had already been explicitly defined as tragic by Josephus himself in the Jewish Wars, not to mention the quasi-tragic interpretation of Israel's languishing condition in Augustine and many other commentators. And that's a whole story of its own, but I'll move on to the fact that the training of a Christian tragic subjectivity was absolutely futile without also reworking the pathos of tragedy itself, the whole frontier of emotions associated with human finitude, fallenness, and fate. We're greatly aided in this regard by a rich newer scholarship on the theory and culture of human emotions in pagan and Christian antiquity, the strength of which has been to show that emotions are not transparent or identical across cultures, but appear as context-specific and have psychological and communal histories or scripts, as well as acquired moral intelligence. David Constant has rightly emphasized that by choosing only fear and pity as the definitive tragic emotions subject to catharsis, Aristotle seriously curtailed the range of prospective passions experienced by an audience. Classicists like Stephen Hollowell and Julian Young have further argued that the catharsis that Aristotle describes should not at last be restricted to tragedy's power to purge or ventilate pent-up emotions. It might also entail a re-education, such as training up fear and pity for real-life experience of the tragic. Christian authors clearly sided with Aristotle against Plato's dismissal that tragic drama could ultimately edify the moral self or grant philosophical insight into the character of human existence under divine providence. So when, early in Book 3 of the Confessions, Augustine muses on the sick pleasure he was enjoying as he bawled with pity for the tragic characters on stage in Carthage, he seems, on one hand, to side with Plato. Theatrical poetics delivers a fictional imitation of reality, so why expend emotional energy on it? On the other hand, Augustine sees that tragic pity might still be a prompt, a practice run to cultivate sincere Christian mercy for tragic characters in real life, such as persons who revel in their vice, for whom one should feel a quality of mercy with absolutely no hint of emotional voyeurism. Patristic moralists thus strained the limits of Aristotelian catharsis in the interest of audiences who were not supposed to be passive emotional observers, but active participants on the church's stage in the metadrama of God's continuing self-revelation amid all manner of human experience of the tragic. At bottom, fear and pity warranted new and aggressive Christian scripts of their own. For Clement of Alexandria, the fear of pain and misery, tragic or otherwise, was not entirely irrational. And he agreed with Stoics that a reasonable cautionary fear, a eulabeia, classed as one of the eupathia, or useful passions, might be in order. But one cannot live by avoidance alone. For Christians, Clement insists the fear of divine chastisement inculcated by divine law is also a species of trepidation at the prospect of pain. but all such fear should undergo gradual transformation and take on new moral intelligence, as it gives way to a salutary reverential fear of God and is finally vanquished by disinterested love of God, as numerous patristic and monastic writers emphasized in quoting 1 John 4:18, where perfect love casts out fear. The catharsis of fear is thus thoroughly sublimated in the quest for spiritual perfection, sealed by a confidence in Jesus' own godly fear, in his resolve to obey the will of the Father. Patristic interpreters may have avoided directly depicting Jesus himself as a tragic hero, given all the moral baggage of classical tragedy. But in the light of biblical evidence, especially the agony of Gethsemane, they insisted on Christ's own initiative in transmuting human fear in the full scope of his passion. Meanwhile, over and beyond its status in tragic theater, pity famously had minimal standing in Greco-Roman moral culture. Turning it into a cardinal virtue was a hard sell indeed. Stoics largely considered pity morally disabling, a feeble response to someone experiencing less an injustice than a contingent misfortune. Only in restricted situations should one pity, such as pitching a coin to a beggar, not to assuage his poverty, but to encourage him to take moral responsibility for his fate. For preachers like Basil, Chrysostom, and Valerian, however, Christian mercy, informed by the vision of the tragic nature of human life, had to move beyond calculations of who deserved what in this world, as if to calibrate mercy solely according to just cause. Theirs, moreover, was no gesture toward what today we call a general solidarity with victims, which still presupposes existential distance. Gregory of Nyssa proposes to close that gap by inculcating what he calls specifically an agapeistic self-identification with those who suffer devastating misfortune, more along the lines of what we would call empathy. Ambrosiaster and Augustine take their cues from the Apostle Paul's commitment to become all things to all people in 1 Corinthians 9. Given the tragic condition of unbelieving Jews, Augustine is impressed that Paul seeks to become a Jew to the Jews out of a deep and deliberate compassion rather than a feigned simulatio. In addition, Christian authors look to expand the repertoire of tragic emotions to include the different species of grief or sorrow. Whereas fear and pity in the face of tragic characters and events, as Augustine testifies, were liable to a pleasurable catharsis. This was far less likely with grief, the more generic version of which, dolor or lupi, could comprehend all manner of emotional pain. Although Augustine puzzled over whether his lamentation over his unnamed friend in North Africa was again anything other than emotional self-indulgence, betraying his overattachment to earthly connections. The Cappadocians, in their consolatory writings, allowed that grief over profound loss, especially loss of her loved ones, had a genuinely tragic dimension of its own, disorienting the soul in the face of what Gregory of Nyssa dubs the deceitfulness of life. Gregory mourned the accidental hunting death of his brother Naucratius, so crushing for his family, as a seemingly senseless tragedy. Basil modulates the grief of the eventual patriarch Nectarius and his wife over their dead son, deploying tragic language as if it is indispensable. And I quote him, "Though all human beings should mourn with us, they will not be able to match our sorrow with their lamentation. Nay, even the waters of the rivers should become tears. They would not suffice to satisfy our lament over what has happened. With him, a great and illustrious family has fallen, dashed to the ground, as if it were by the removal of the prop. O earth, that has been compelled to submit to passion like this. Doubtless even the sun, if it had any power to feel, must have shuddered at this horrible spectacle. And what can anyone say commensurate with that which the soul in its complete helplessness prompts one to utter, unquote. Such a discourse doubtless aimed to enhance, by contrast, the sweetness of the resurrection hope, but not without generous room for contemplating the internal dynamics of abject despair, the sickness unto death, as Kierkegaard termed it. Gregory of Nyssa responds to Macrona's admission that brutal personal sorrow could overwhelm his mind by exploring with her the positive utility of such a passion in refining desire for ultimate and enduring realities. In his homily on the second beatitude, Gregory further recontextualizes grief over personal loss as an occasion not for self-pity, but for a deep melancholy over the tragically fallen state of the world, in a manner not unlike Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. Tragic grief, however, was scarcely only for individual expression. Lest we forget, the church navigated all the tragic emotions, but especially grief and lamentation, through highly articulated liturgical performance. In his Kontakia, Romanus the Melodist deftly teases out these tragic emotions, both virtuous and vicious, not only in celebrated biblical characters, but also in the live audience, as it assumes its role in the dramatic mimetics of liturgy. Romanus, moreover, would not only have us humans, but the entire cosmos lament the massacre of the holy innocents or the death of Jesus, not just for collective sorrow's sake, but as inducing Christians' contrition for their own complacency in worldly evil. Indeed, the other potent tragic mourning of penthos and compunction, developed through liturgical confession of sin, required also the assiduous mimesis of specific biblical figures, as attested in Romanus's profoundly moving Kontakion on the sinful woman. Such godly sorrow, as Paul had called it, demanded tightly defined scripts and protocols, lest sin become abstract and compunction succumb to self-pity. In monastic tradition, penthos effectively meant making oneself the object of one's tragic conscience, under the realization that one is inseparably implicated in human fallenness. We all need to weep with Adam, not for him. As the Sinite monastic theologian John Climacus puts it, we must weep over our sin as if we are already in the grave. We are already the walking dead. Early desert elders ingeniously dramatized this penthos by prescribing tragicomical object lessons, as when Abba Macarius enjoined one monk to go and abuse the dead by throwing rocks at their tombs, then to go back again and extol them up and down, whereupon their stone silence to the curses and praise would help to mortify the monk as well, returning him again to the ground zero of penitential self-awareness. As I conclude, my hope is that the theatrics and dramatics that I have described in patristic and monastic sources, especially evident in the multifaceted mimesis of tragedy and dark comedy in expounding biblical narratives and engaging the specter of mundane tragedies, were not a matter of mere rhetorical frill or dramatic flair, specious attempts simply to elicit affect. I strongly concur with Morwenna Ludlow's judgment that such rhetorical art and craft still had a profoundly theological anchoring and purpose. Despite sympathy with Plato's rebuke of the poets for their distraction from philosophy, Tragic mimetics, in the long run, provided a crucial complement to traditional Christian defenses of divine providence by indulging audiences in imagining a world devoid of justice and grace. A world edging toward dystopia. Dystopia at best, nothingness at worst. It served to ingrain instructionally and pastorally a sobered Christian subjectivity and help to reorient and refine the scripts of human emotion associated with pluriform tragedy. Tragic mimesis also, in effect, carried forward Paul's vision in Romans 8 of the world as divinely subjugated to vanity, paradoxically a vanity in hope, and ultimately turned hope itself, an emotion with a bleak pedigree in Hellenistic moral philosophy, into a tragic virtue, cleansed of superficially pious optimism or aspiration to pure transcendence. Earlier I mentioned Gregory Nazianzen's emotionally charged rhetorical flirtation with fate. And this is even more pronounced, artfully so, in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, where he has Lady Philosophy allowing the goddess Fortuna to have her say as governess of the inconstancy of life and its lack of a calculus of just recompense. She even chides Boethius for not having learned precisely from the ancient tragedies about the precariousness of life. So too, by problematizing default theodicies, theodicies at a safe distance, monumentally exemplified in Job's pretentious comforters. Tragic mimetics pressed the Christian conscience not just to contemplate the mysteriousness of God's ways with creation, but also to hear with new ears the outcries of the tragic heroes, villains, and victims in sacred history and in the church's foreground. Patristic interpreters attempted to make some kind of theological sense of the senselessness of Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter, which was one among other valuable exegetical testing grounds for larger debates on divine justice and impassibility that endured throughout antiquity. Though figural and allegorical readings of Jacob and Esau or other puzzling texts were always an option, these interpretive strategies could not become default mechanisms of their own. Working toward a coherent representation of the salvific divine economy was one thing. Erasing the ineluctable strangeness of much biblical narrative was an undesirable other. Which leads me to a final reflection. Tragic mimesis, as a rhetorical and interpretive art form, took Origen's notion of the providentially embedded scandola of Scripture and the divine accommodation therein in a novel theological direction. Graphic tragedy and tragicomedy in the Bible were not simply accidents of textuality or embarrassments to be resolved. They were narrated events inhabited by the Logos himself. The hidden but active revealer in Scripture, whose kenotic embodiments in Scripture, in Jesus Christ, and in the world were intrinsically scandalizing and scandalous. The title of my lecture, Playing Along with the Playful Logos, derives from Gregory Nazianzen's poetic phrase, quote, "The Logos on high plays in all sorts of forms, mingling with his world here and there as he so desires," unquote. Later on, Maximus the Confessor, fusing this image with Paul's reflection in 1 Corinthians 1, takes Gregory's phrase as perfectly dramatizing the sublime folly and scandal of the divine word in his communications in the world. His salutary tease and play of illusion and manifestation. The mimesis of tragedy in Christian writers, homilists, poets, ascetics, and hagiographers was a way of playing along, taking the bait, as it were, making a move, so as to embolden Christians' imagination of the many subplots in the Creator's relentless battle with evil, ignorance, and suffering in creation. In retrospect, the deployment of tragic modes of discourse revealed the maturing virtuosity and freedom of Christian authors, especially preachers and hymnists, forcefully but benevolently to scandalize their audiences, spurring them to search for Christ even in the darkest corners of sacred history and the most disorienting abysses of human experience. As ministers of the Christian faithful, this was their vocation and responsibility. As expositors of sacred revelation, entrusted with illuminating the Bible and the cosmos in all of their interrelated complexities and obscurities. This was, if not their own tragic fate, at least an enormous interpretive and theological gauntlet that they had no choice but to run, using every rhetorical and artistic resource that they could muster. Thank you for your attention. Have a great conference.